It's my honor and delight to introduce our second keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Matthew Kaemingk. He is an ethicist. He is a public theologian. He serves as the Richard John Mao as the Richard John Mao Chair of Faith and Public Life at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he also directs the Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. He also serves as a research fellow at the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C., and is a scholar in residence at the Dupree Center for Christian Leadership. And he has written many books, including this book, Work and Worship, which we have right out there, which is all about the subject we're talking about. How do we integrate worship into our work lives, and how do we integrate work into our Sunday morning experience, and so that these two, Sunday money, get connected. Matt and his wife, Heather, have 3 boys. So Matt's in the middle of all that as a dad. And I might add that Matt's wife, Heather, also leads worship at the church that they attend. So he's got, his wife is in that world as well. And finally, I just want to add that Matt is a dear friend. We were doctoral students together and have presented papers at various places. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Matthew Kaemingk.
Thanks, buddy. It's good to be with you. It was the 7th century, small village. The Pope was coming to town. Huge moment for this village. The Pope was coming, and he was going to be celebrating communion. The whole village gathers, and they come down the aisle to take communion from the Pope, the biggest moment in their lives. And in that line was a young woman. She comes forward. The Pope breaks the bread and say, "The body of Christ, body and blood of Christ for you." Now in this huge moment, the whole congregation is silent. She bursts out laughing. Laughing. Naturally, there's a bit of a commotion, quite scandalous, not a good look when the Pope is in town. And they manage to calm her down. She takes her communion in her seat, and afterwards, they ask her, the village gathers around, "What happened? Why did you do this?" And here's what she said. She said, "Well, when I looked down in the Pope's hand, he was holding a piece of bread that I baked in my oven. He was holding in my little oven, in my little kitchen, the Pope. He was holding it, and he was saying that my work, right, was a part of the work of God in the world." That moment there in worship completely transformed the way that she saw her oven, her kitchen, and the daily mundane things that she was doing. It was too hard for her to imagine that this, what may have been such a small, mundane thing, could be a part of this much larger work of God. My hope today is that we can have a similar experience. That will be so overwhelming that the small, mundane, sometimes frustrating things that we do on a daily basis, we'll be able to see them in a new light. There's bread. Unfortunately, it's hard, right? We hear the message from Kara, beautiful message about your work being worship. It's good. It matters to God. You can serve Jesus in your daily work, and you kind of know it up here, but you don't always feel it in your bones, do you? Like, I hear you up here, Kara. My work matters, but Tuesday rolls around and I'm just mad. I'm just frustrated. I'm just bored. I'm not feeling the tingles that I do in worship, right? We all know this feeling of this disintegration of work and worship, this Sunday morning experience that feels in this way and our Monday morning experience that feels very different. We can feel this chasm, this divorce between our worshiping life and our working life. I don't really need to spend much time proving this to you because you know it just existentially. This is tough. We as Christians, often in the West, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, in the West, we are living our lives in pieces. Sunday, sanctuary, worship. Monday, streets, work. We have our personal, spiritual, quiet times in the morning, and then we have our public lives and our public reason. And we feel this angst, living our lives in pieces. And friends, when we live our lives in pieces, those pieces start to fall apart, right? Our work can become idolatrous, broken, twisted. And actually, our experience of worship can start to feel numb. It can start to feel distant. The Bible actually talks about people who sing all the right songs and pray all the right prayers, and yet they don't feel God's presence. And what do the prophets say? They say that's because you've created this divide between what you're doing in the marketplace and what you're doing in the temple. So there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I do want to share one time I walked into worship, and this well-meaning worship leader, he was strumming his guitar. You know how they do, and they're welcoming us to worship, and he says, guys, I know you've all had a big week. You've got a lot on your minds. Lots of work, lots of schedules, lots of moving kids about. You're thinking about a lot of things. But for this next hour of worship, I want you to put all that aside and just focus on God. Now, he was well-meaning, but this was a devastating thing to say. Why? Because what he was communicating was that God doesn't want to hear it. This is not the place to be thinking about work. God doesn't want you to bring your work to him. This is a spiritual place where we're going to kind of pretend for the next hour that the whole week didn't happen. Another thing, in my church we had a mission map. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a map, and it had our missionaries all around the world with little flags, and we were invited to pray for the missionaries around the world. We also had a map of our city, and it had the different nonprofits that we supported, like the homeless shelter and the food pantry, things like that. And it said, God is at work above there. Now my mother, I remember this, my mother, she was a nurse, and she cared for mothers and babies after birth. She ministered to them at that very fragile, special time. She cared for them in that hospital. That was where she did ministry. That was her mission. My dad was a carpenter. They built cabinets, and he ran a company, and he would bring in people who were sometimes down on their luck, had made some mistakes, and he gave them a job, some training, skills, and he ministered to them. That was his mission. Now, my mother's hospital and my father's cabinet shop were nowhere on that mission map. There was no flag for them. No one ever brought my parents forward in worship and prayed for them and laid hands on them for their ministry, right? From time to time, the youth group would come forward and share about their work. They'd go to Mexico or they'd do something, and my parents would pray for them and send them. But 40 hours a week, 365 days a year, my parents are on mission, right? And their work's not mentioned. And so there's all kinds of subtle ways in which the world can divide our work and our worship, but there's all kinds of subtle ways in which actually our experience of worship can create this separation. And so what we're going to get after here today is how might we start to make these walls more porous, right? How can we begin a conversation between our work out in the streets and our worship in the sanctuary? How might we begin a conversation with God about these things? How can this begin to settle into our bones so that when we hear Kara tell us, we can work with God? We don't just know it up here, but we feel it in here. In our book, Work and Worship, we came across an ancient practice which is we can find in the Old Testament, in the early church, and quite active in the global church, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and I want to share that with you. The way these people connect their faith in God and their relationship to God to their working lives is actually not intellectual. It's quite practical. And I want to talk you through that practice. The practice is that you actually carry your work to God. You actually need to bring it to Him. And I'm going to give you a couple of practices for how we do that. But first I want to tell you just briefly, we are singing some songs today, and you're hearing some music today that comes out of a songwriting project called Worship for Workers. Just this last year, in Nashville, Tennessee, we gathered songwriters and musicians to write songs about work and vocation. You can find it on like Spotify, Apple Music. It's being released just now. And it's all built around songs that help people carry their work to God in worship. And that was the task. They also wrote a series of prayers and blessings for workers that you can look at. There's prayers for administrative assistants. There's prayers for police officers. It's a growing movement. And if any of you are prayer writers or songwriters and you'd like to be involved in this effort, you are very welcome to join it. So it's called worshipforworkers.com, and there are songs and prayers and liturgies on there. So if you'd like to share this with your worship leader, you can do that. Okay, there's your commercial. All right, so an ancient practice of bringing your work to God. For the ancient Israelites, there were 5 things that they knew they could bring to God. 5 things that they could talk to God about when it came to their work. And the titles here are trumpets, ashes, tears, petitions, and fruits. So let's talk through these things that you can talk to God about work. The first is trumpets. Like, God, you have won a victory for me. You have brought rain. You have brought justice. You have brought flourishing to my fields and to my marketplace, and it is right and good to praise God. What does that mean for all of you? It means in each one of your lives and work, God has won some victory, something that you didn't earn. And it is right and good to blow a trumpet of praise to Him for that victory. Now, why was that so important to the people of Israel? Because the danger is you start to believe that you did it, that you're the reason the harvest came in, that you're the reason you have this promised land, that you're the reason your shop is flourishing. And the same is for you, right? If you're not blowing trumpets of praise to God about what He's doing at work, you start to be blowing them towards yourself. Okay? The second one is ashes of confession. You can bring your burdens of confession, your guilt. Each one of us has guilt for how we behave in the workplace. We're not always proud about how we act, right? And honestly, our feelings of guilt can be dealt with in all kinds of terrible ways. We can drink, we can try and numb that pain, we can just binge Netflix, but we can kind of like numb our hearts and try to forget that guilt about how we've behaved towards someone or another. But the people of Israel actually had a way to deal with guilt. If you cheated someone in the marketplace, you not only made restitution with them, but you went to the temple, you went to the altar, and you confessed to God, and you made a sacrifice, and you dealt with it, right? You don't just numb that conscience, but you dealt with it. Tears of lament, crying out. This is the first thing that the Israelites learn about God. They're enslaved in Egypt, toiling terribly, total injustice, exhaustion. And the first thing they learn about God is that they can cry out to Him. Did you know that you are allowed to complain to God? It's okay to complain to God. And moreover, the Israelites understood that God would respond with a mighty hand. But I know that for some Christians, they have a hard time complaining to God. They have a hard time bringing their tears to God and being honest with God about that suffering, right? So it's one thing to hear Kara say, our work is cursed and it's hard. It's another thing to say, you can tell God about that, right? You can bring those tears to God. So it's not just to explain your tears. Here's why you're sad at work. Here's why you are frustrated. But you can bring that frustration to God. The fourth is petitions, which is a sort of intercession where you pray for God to move in the marketplace. You make a petition. You make a request. God, would you bring justice here? God, would you bring rain? God, would you bring flourishing? And the fifth and final thing is your first fruits, right? Here you see the people bringing their first fruits. It was interesting in the opening, we talked about the tapestry, sort of the diversity of this church. And often we think of diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and culture. And of course, there's that. But have you ever thought about the diversity of a church in terms of vocations? That you have janitors and nurses and CEOs and people who are unemployed and people who are stay-at-home parents and retired. And each one of them brings very diverse things into the church. They don't all bring the same thing. And the interesting thing about ancient Israel was there was a wide variety of things that you could lay on the altar, right? Everyone didn't bring a cow. Some people would bring bread and grain and even like beer. Doves. What you brought, there was a great hospitality at the altar. What you made could be welcomed. Furthermore, the people of Israel believed that God had nostrils. God had nostrils. Now, we often think about God having eyes, like he's watching you, right? God's watching you, and maybe like he's making sure you do the right thing and not the wrong thing. But for the people of ancient Israel, they believed God had nostrils. And what this meant was that when you brought forth your work, the thing that you were really proud of, the unique thing that you made, God didn't just look at it. God, he breathed it in, and the aroma brought pleasure to him. Now, if you brought something that you had stolen or cheated someone or somehow unjustly got it, claimed it as your own, the aroma would be offensive to God, and he would not accept the sacrifice. But he appreciated the beauty and the goodness that you brought the best goat. You brought the most fruitful grapes. So God is blessed by the beauty and the goodness of your work. And he takes delight in it. This is some of the oldest artwork that we have in the Christian faith. This comes from one of the oldest churches that we have found. In the 3rd century AD, this is somewhere outside of Venice, a fishing village. And this particular mural is in the worship space, and it's called The Donors. And what you see here in the worship space is the boy over here, he's donating bread. He's bringing bread. This woman, she's bringing grapes, and it looks like she's got some chickens there with her too. This boy's bringing fish, and this woman's bringing flowers. The early Christians didn't necessarily bring coins to offer. But in some of the very first worship services for early Christians, they would bring the work of their hands into the community, and the deacons would accept those gifts, and they'd create like a pile. And this is how the worship service would begin. And the priests are instructed, there was like a rule that you had to name the worker, and there's a blessing for cheese, and there's a blessing for olives, and there's a blessing for fish, and you pray a blessing on the home. And the people would watch their work as it was distributed to the poor. It was distributed to care for the pastor's family, and then a good portion of it was celebrated in worship for the meal. And it was lifted up and said, these are the gifts of God for the people of God. This is God's work. Your work was right there in worship. And so they would bring these things. Furthermore, like I said, this is a fishing village. And it's interesting the artwork they chose. Does anyone know the Bible story you're seeing here? Give you a hint. Check out the sea monster. Yeah, it's Jonah. It's Jonah. But these are fishermen. These are fishermen. And they're proud. They're proud of the work that they do. And they believe that God is proud and that God is with them on the sea. It's a dangerous thing. But they see this deep connection between their work and their worship. That it's not improper. I used to live and worship in Houston, and of course in Houston it's all oil and gas workers. And I gave this talk, and I said, "What if we put an oil rig in the stained glass window?" And then of course they were scandalized. "This is terrible. This is a sacred space." I'm like, "Well, do you think God's with you when you go out on the rig? That's dangerous work. Aren't you scared? But these people understood that it wasn't scandalous to put their fishing adventures into their worship space because God was with them. We see this today in the global church. Right here is an altar. It was created right here in California for grape pickers during the 1960s and 70s who were struggling for fair pay. Dehumanized workers picking grapes throughout the, is it called the Central Valley? Yeah, I'm trying to be local here. The Central Valley, Mexican farm workers, and a Catholic priest commissioned an artist to create an altar where they would celebrate communion for the farm workers. And what this piece of art was to do was to remind the farm workers that Jesus is with them in the fields, right? That cross is planted right amongst the grapes. He's with you here. He's not waiting for you back at church. And he sees your struggle. He knows your suffering, right? Your injustice he's not indifferent to that. But they created this way for the farm workers to understand the connection between their work in the grapes and the blood of Jesus. A church was planted near a sweatshop just outside of Singapore. And in these sweatshops, the workers are given numbers, not names. Okay? So all day long, they're called by this number. It's a very dehumanizing practice, right? And this church thought it would be wise to write a song talking about how Jesus knows my name. Jesus calls my name, and he's written my name in his book, reminding them and pushing back against this experience at work. In Zimbabwe, there are huge harvest festivals where people will retain this ancient practice of bringing forward the work of their hands and celebrating the goodness of God in the harvest. And you can still find African immigrant churches here in the United States who will have offering services that build these kinds of connections. A Kenyan pastor responded to the fact that many people in Nairobi would commute long distances in trains on their way to work, and they couldn't come to church because they were working all the time. And so what did he do? He planted his church on the train. So they worship on their way to work on the train. In the Ukraine, the apple harvest is met with the liturgy of the Transfiguration, where they celebrate the transfiguration of Jesus and his glory and the transfiguration of an apple seed into an apple that feeds the people. And right there, the worship is responsive to what the people are actually going through, right? So you're able to have a conversation. Of course, the entire African American church is built, it was founded on this connection between work and worship, that God is with me in the fields. And all of their songs come from that experience. They were not written in a distant church. They were written in the fields and remind them in beautiful and heartbreaking ways about God's presence and power with them. I don't have time for all this stuff, but there's lots of other good things. Okay. You can read the book. available on Amazon and outside. So the question here, friends, is who is the offering for? Who is the offering for? We often think that the offering is for God, or the offering is for the church, or the offering is for all the great things that the church is doing in the world. I would submit to you, friends, that that is absolutely not a biblical understanding of offering. Those things are good and meaningful, but first and foremost, the offering that we see in Scripture is actually for the offerer. It's for you. It is a gift that God has given you that you get to bring your whole self to Him. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. This understanding that the moment of harvest for the people of Israel was the most spiritually dangerous moment for them. They understood the moment of harvest is the most spiritually dangerous moment because it's this moment where all this wealth comes into you, right? All this stuff is pouring in. And there's all kinds of dangers involved. One, you think it's for you. You think you can hoard it. And you think it's going to give you security. So there's all kinds of lies that can happen when that harvest comes in. And the offering was this gift that God gave that said, here is this moment, and if you ever want to read this, Deuteronomy 26, in your spare time, read this. It is an instruction manual for what the farmer does at harvest. And he has to bring before the whole community his first fruits, lay down and confess that without God, he'd still be a slave in Egypt. Without God, he'd have no land. Without God, nothing would grow. And then at the end of this worship service, he picks up the basket and they have a huge feast. And he shares it with his servants and his family, his community, with the orphans and the widows. And they celebrate the goodness of God's work. Not the farmer's work, the goodness of God's work. And the offering is meant to change the way he sees his fields, the way he sees his servants, the way he sees the foreigners. Friends, the offering is not this favor that you do to God. The ancient Israelites, they believed their God was not hungry, like he needed food. The other gods around Israel were angry and selfish. So like if you didn't give Baal food, he wouldn't give you water. He wouldn't give you rain, right? Or he wouldn't give you fertility. So you give God things, you make him happy, and then he gives you things back. That is not how offering worked in ancient Israel. The offering is for us. It's this time where we can remember that we would still be in Egypt without him. Right? And as you reflect on your story, your own story, think about where you would be without him. The first confession the farmer makes in Deuteronomy 26 is, my father was a wandering Aramean. He had no land. It's a reference to Abraham, right? That Abraham's just kind of lost wandering about. And if it wasn't for God, we'd still be wandering about. We'd still be wandering in the wilderness. So the offering is this moment when we can reflect on where we would be without him, and we can reorient ourselves to that work. And that completely changes the way we read this section of Paul in Romans 12, which we've referenced earlier this morning. Paul tells the gospel story, right? Romans chapter 1 through 11 tells the big gospel story that we all know. And then he hits us with this big therefore. Therefore, what do I do because of what Jesus has done? Here's how you're supposed to respond. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, in view of what God's done, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. It's not offer your hearts. It's not offer your quiet times. It's not offer your Sunday mornings. It's not offer your money. We have a jealous God. He wants the whole thing. And that's profoundly good news, right? For those of us who have tried to live on our own, right? To try to live by our own ways, we recognize the prison that represents and the freedom that comes when you lay it down. And you think about that Israelite farmer again. Proud farmer who owns this land, has all of these servants, and he lays down in front of the whole community. Very embarrassing thing to do. But that's where you find freedom. And here, you see the donors, the boy bringing his bread, the grapes, the fish. The early Christians understood that freedom was found in the offering. It was a gift. And so many of us give an offering electronically, don't we? Like a bank transfer. I do that. But something important is lost when a bank transfer happens at 3 a.m., right? And I'm not a part of it at all. There's no reflection on what God has done. There's no time to praise and feast and share. Something for us to continue to reflect on. How might you handle your harvest, your bonus, your promotion, your new job, your new company? How might you stop and celebrate and share? Last bit, the great little piece of artwork. You have all these diverse workers doing very different things, and in the center, they're bringing their offerings to Jesus. So, friends, as we pivot to a time of quiet reflection, so you've had people talking at you, and then you've had your discussion, but we're actually going to have a little quiet time now. And you are going to practice offering some things to God. And I'm going to give you that space. And this is an Eastern Orthodox theologian. His name's Alexander Schmemann. It's a great name. Can we all say Schmemann? Schmemann. This is how he opens up the time of communion. He says, the time has come now to offer to God the totality of all our lives, of ourselves, of the world in which we live. This is the first meaning of our bringing to the altar the elements of our food. The bread and the wine that we made it with our hands. That's what's happening in communion. We're bringing that forward. We bring our work to God, and then he gives back his work on the cross. And in that giving, our work is transformed. And so here's my invitation to you. And we're going to try this out just now as an opening practice, but my hope is that you would make this a practice in your own lives. What are your trumpets? How has God won victories for you that you did not deserve, but he blew it open, and you need to respond with praise? What are your ashes of confession? What is the guilt from your work that you need to bring and be relieved of? What are your tears of lament? The injustice you experience in the work. Perhaps you experience sexism in the workplace, or racism in the workplace, or just unfairness, and you have no answer, and you don't understand what God is doing. Some of you today, friends, there are people in this room who the only thing they can carry to God today is tears about their work. I know some of you love your jobs, and it's awesome, but I just want to say to those of you who are really suffering at work, you can bring your tears to God. If that's all you've got, bring those tears. Petitions would be, you want to pray for others, not just for yourself, but God, there's an employee that I need you to I want to intercede for them, right? I want to intercede for my boss. I need you to move on their behalf. And then fruits, this is the fun one, this is the last one. Fruits are the things that you're really proud of, the things that you just geek out about at work. That's the best biblical analog for what they're talking about. Have you ever had a time at work where you suddenly realize you've been working for like 4 hours and you didn't even feel it because you loved it so much, like you just geeked out on this thing. Some of you might not be able to relate to this right now, but some of you will, where you just zone out and you just love this thing. And in fact, it's very hard to communicate to your friends and family how much you love it, because they look at you like, what? You enjoy that? But it's this profound experience of delight, of being in the flow, of being in the zone. And friends, I have to tell you about that experience of delight you feel. God delights in that moment for you. God is with you, and he's geeking out right next to you because he made you for that. And friends, this is the moment where you can offer that thing you geek out that no one else understands. You can offer that to God as well. So let's take some time. We're going to listen to a little bit of music that's been written for the Worship for Workers practice, but just take this time and write down. You have in your notebook the questions and a little bit of space for you to do this writing. Spend whatever time you need to on tears, ashes, but just write words, write phrases, things that God puts on your mind and heart. Offer your work to God.